Name the stars over your cauldron, and all that lies beneath your waves. Throwing my voice into your shadow, the underworld, the darkest place. The onyx kiss of inky waters, the jet black undertow of fright. From the cold depths now I will conjure the spiral madness of his mind. Once more the ocean's a lake, so alike lit awake. Come save your soul, awake new and whole. By name I will summon him. From the silence of screams, from the city of dreams, it's a dark ocean summoning.
I've been a fan of Alan Wake since just after it first came out. To put things in perspective, I was 11 when I first played the game, and I'm 23 now. Much like was the case with the Mirror's Edge retrospective, this game was one of those formative works that blew my world wide open, and completely changed what I thought a video game could be. It was weird, it was dark, and it was very, very scary to my tween-aged brain. See, around the time that I started playing Alan Wake, a lot of my contemporaries had moved on to things like Halo and Call of Duty, but my parents were stricter, and wouldn't let me play those games at home, so anything I played had to skirt those M-rated lines. There was a very limited pool of video games that were rated T and lower that still seemed to be cool to me at that age. Then along comes this game about a novelist getting attacked by creepy shadow monsters in the woods that features basically no blood or strong language and is just adult enough to seem cool while not jumping into that more M-rated territory. It's safe to say that I didn't really get Alan Wake when I was 11, but I sure as shit enjoyed the hell out of it. I was, right then and there, minted into one of Remedy Entertainment's most ardent fans. Now it's 2024, and the game that I thought was going to remain a hidden gem for the rest of my life has received not only a crossover with its shared universe sister series, Control, but a full-on sequel that's been met with rave reviews and multiple awards. I waited for Alan Wake 2 for over 10 years, thinking it would never come, and now, lo and behold, here it is in all of its high-definition glory. So, with this resurgence of the series, I wanted to revisit not only the original game, but Control and Alan Wake 2 as well. This video is going to be a celebration and dissection of all the things that I love about the RCU games, and Remedy as a studio. Now that I'm older and have a much greater capacity for critical thought, I do actually get Alan Wake, and that makes me love it all the more. So without further ado, let's dissect the RCU, and figure out just what makes Mr. Sam Lake tick. Like most of the games I really love, Alan Wake is a bizarre title. In fact, all of Remedy's games are. Since Max Payne, their second ever release, Remedy and their captain, Sam Lake, have delighted in the strange, the meta, and mixed media approaches to game design. Pretty much every one of Remedy's games leverages all three of these concepts, and I would argue that they're core to their design philosophy. Interestingly enough, Alan Wake is probably the tamest on all of those fronts, but at the time of release, it was still extremely odd. The gameplay is very much conventional. It follows the standard third-person shooter mechanics of the time almost to a T, its unique attribute being the need to burn the shields of darkness off of enemies before killing them. Where Alan Wake becomes truly weird is in its narrative and that narrative's presentation. When the game was released, it was a modest cult hit, releasing the same week as Rockstar mega hit Red Dead Redemption. That game also obviously deserved every sale and accolade it got, but a game like Alan Wake releasing alongside something so stunning from such a well-known studio basically ensured the game would underperform in terms of sales figures. The game was a huge critical success though, and that word of mouth allowed it to spread until it reached the cult status that it held, until Alan Wake 2 shot the franchise into more mainstream success this past year. Alan Wake is the story of the titular writer going on a vacation to cure his writer's block, and getting a lot more than just that in the bargain. A dark presence that lurks beneath Cauldron Lake abducts his wife, Alice, and uses Alan to write a new book, wherein it will escape the lake and take over the world. That's the story on the surface. Diving into the lake, though, Alan Wake is actually a meta-commentary on editorial control of artistry, and the ways in which it stifles creativity. I'll delve deep into that allegory later, but what I want to examine more immediately are the game's most obvious creative influences. It's been openly stated by Sam Lake and the staff at Remedy that Alan Wake is heavily inspired by both Twin Peaks and the works of Stephen King. The Stephen King influence is extremely obvious. Hell, the game even starts with a quotation from the famous writer and has numerous direct references to his work. The direct parallels and allusions, though, are a lot less important than the more indirect Stephen King trademarks that the story borrows. The writer-protagonist is a classic Kingism. Alan Wake slots right in with contemporaries such as Paul Sheldon and Jack Torrance, as is the setting of the rural town with dark supernatural secrets. Sure, King's small towns are usually in Maine and not the Pacific Northwest, but Bright Falls would still be right on the money as a Stephen King setting. It's these more general Stephen King tropes that make the game feel as though it could actually be one of King's works, rather than just a reference to them. As far as the Twin Peaks parallels go, I can't recommend Monty Zander's spectacular critique of the game enough. I know if you're watching a video about Alan Wake, you've probably already heard of his work, since he's something of a champion of the fanbase now, but the critique perfectly sums up the game's allusions to Twin Peaks. His work is generally fantastic, by the way. It's a huge inspiration, and I'm a big fan. Still proud to have the top comment on the Arkham Asylum video, by the way. Fanboying aside, suffice it to say that there are numerous direct and broader parallels, as was the case with Stephen King's work. What's odd about Alan Wake is that, as far as horror games go, it really isn't that scary per se. I mean, obviously everyone will have different tastes and different definitions of what is and isn't scary, but Alan Wake overall just isn't that horrific of a work. In fact, it doesn't even bill itself as a horror game in the first place, bearing the text, "a psychological action thriller" on the box. While that subtitle certainly is unwieldy, I do find it to be an accurate representation of the game's creative priorities. There are absolutely spooky and creepy elements to Alan Wake, but it's lacking in the more traditional traits of horror media. Often when Alan enters a combat encounter, the camera will pan out in a sweeping slow motion, showing you the entire arena and all the enemies coming to get you. Generally, if the game was trying to scare the player, it would be more appropriate to just completely blindside them with these ambushes. The game is also distinctly lacking in resource scarcity, a key trait of most action horror titles. The player is always fed more than enough resources to get by in the main campaign, to the point where I never really felt like I was struggling, even on Nightmare difficulty. None of this is bad. It's simply to say that Alan Wake is more interested in deconstructing the tropes of horror media and popular fiction broadly than it is in actually being scary itself. During the day, the game is a straight-up comedy half the time due to Barry and Alan's back-and-forth banter, and when you're moving around at night, Alan's writerly narration serves as a constant reminder that you are not Alan and Alan isn't you. In fact, I think this wedge between player and protagonist is exactly what Remedy was going for. Where most games strive for player immersion and identification with the protagonist, I think Remedy consciously tries to hedge against identity grafting in all their games. The team at Remedy revel in the uncanny, and with each successive title in this video, you'll see that revelry escalate further and further. One of the ways it comes through here in the first game, though, is Alan's messages to himself on the TV. Occasionally, during the episodes of Alan Wake, a TV you're walking by will turn itself on and show a live-action video of Ilkka Ville, the Finnish actor who mocapped for Alan, frantically raving about the process of writing Departure. While these short clips serve as a way of letting you in on specific parts of what happened during Alan's missing week when he was writing Departure in the Dark Place, The deliberate use of what's essentially 90s style FMV creates a surreal atmosphere, where mid-7th gen 3D models and live-action video exist side by side. As I've said in the past, the 7th console generation was never very good at animating people and faces. Alan Wake is no exception to that rule. The choice to juxtapose that weakness in 7th gen rendering with live-action footage is deliberately jarring and wonderfully eerie. This meta-fixation on real-world actors and people crossing over into the world of the game and vice versa comes through in Alan Wake's music as well. One of the most iconic sequences in the game features Alan and Barry defending the Anderson brothers' stage while being assaulted by Taken. The badass hair metal track Children of the Elder God plays the entire time, and the sequence is a real home run, setting off the trend of the Remedy musical level that appears in every official RCU title. This trend is one of my favorites in Remedy's work, and so I've decided that in each game we discuss in this video, I'll be ranking the different Remedy musical levels. The stage show is a really solid one, and it's the classic originator. This sequence has stuck in my head as one of the best moments not only in Alan Wake, but in all of my favorite games. The track is fantastic, Barry's commentary is great, and the rhythm of combat flows very well with the song. It's not quite as well curated as some of the other ones that will come later, but it is the first, and it was good enough to set the standard. For that, the stage show earns the number 3 spot in the Remedy musical level ranking list. What's more interesting about this sequence, though, is that it's performed by a group called Old Gods of Asgard, which itself is a fictional band in the RCU, but also the real-life band Poets of the Fall, but now also the real-life band Old Gods of Asgard, who have their very own greatest hits album featuring the numerous songs they've written for the RCU games. Even within Alan Wake 1, there's a hidden radio message that implies that the real Poets of the Fall exist within the RCU as well. These meta elements are one of the things that really makes me have fun with the RCU, but also plays into the themes of Alan Wake specifically in an interesting way. A lot of Alan Wake's narrative is about real people being turned into characters in a story, and with this meta inclusion of real actors and musicians in the universe, that power crosses the line over into reality a little bit. A line which will become far blurrier in Alan Wake 2. I want to take a moment now and discuss Alan Wake's level design, because it's one of the most unique aspects of the game as far as mechanics go. It's well known that Alan Wake was actually supposed to have an open world. That dream never did come to fruition, but remnants of it can be seen throughout the entire game in a very strange way. Alan Wake is what I would call a semi-linear game. Essentially, each episode has its own small series of open worlds. There's no side questing or anything like that, but Alan Wake's levels are massive in scale, far more massive than they need to be, and that's because each one is a fragment of that originally planned open world. This makes Bright Falls feel like a very casually believable space, almost more so than if it were a full open world to begin with. You don't really see games with levels like Alan Wake's, because in most development processes, to create levels of this size for a linear game would be a tremendous waste of effort and resources. At the same time, many open worlds become unbelievable because they're inherently a miniaturization of a real-world landscape, especially back in the early 2010s. It was only through the failure of Alan Wake's ambitious open world that we came to this semi-linear style. Alan Wake's episodes present very believable slices of a quaint northwestern town that, together, suggest a much more impressive picture of Bright Falls than I think a 2010 open world would have been able to accomplish. It's also partially because of that open world that Alan Wake was in development hell for years. The team struggled endlessly to bring Alan Wake and Bright Falls to life, only to fail. In a video for Ars Technica around the time of Control's release, Sam Lake actually directly states that this failure and the struggle to create a work that would differentiate itself from and top Max Payne are what inspired Alan Wake's narrative. Alan's personal story of trying to move on from Alex Casey, a very clear allusion to Max Payne, is directly parallel to the story of Remedy trying to find their way as a studio. That focus on creativity also brought with it the conceit of the Dark Presence, a massive malevolent resonance slumbering in Cauldron Lake that twists and uses the work of artists to bring itself power. I don't know which of his editors or publishers pissed in Sam Lake's cereal, but my reading of Alan Wake leads me to believe that he has a very low opinion of them. It's telling that while the Dark Presence seems menacing, it has very little power of its own. It's a parasitic resonance, latching itself onto creative minds and exploiting them to the fullest. For all of its reality-altering powers, the Dark Presence itself can't actually create anything at all. Even the way it manifests itself is stolen, having invaded the body of Thomas Zane's lover, Barbara Jagger. Ugh, that's a hard name to pronounce. Try saying that 3 times fast. The Dark Presence isn't even the only evil editor in Alan Wake. Dr. Emil Hartman also features as a secondary antagonist. Hartman runs Cauldron Lake Lodge, a therapeutic retreat for mentally ill artists, like Alan. What he really does there, though, is more sinister. When he was younger, he actually served as Thomas Zane's assistant, and he saw the powers that Cauldron Lake could exert on reality firsthand. Cauldron Lake Lodge, then, is an opportunity for Hartman. Just like the Dark Presence, he seeks to use the artists there to create works of art that come true for his own personal benefit, malicious editorial control, trying to siphon the fruits of creative minds. The Taken too conform to this theme. It's shown that the more power the Dark Presence exerts over someone, the less capable of novel thought they become. That's why the Taken speak in random, clipped-up lines of mundane dialogue.
Oh, hell. Carl Stuckey. Pleased to meet you.
They're no longer capable of the act of creation or novel thought at all, and therefore have to rely on snippets of their old life to communicate anything. The editorial control has become so strong that all creativity is stifled, even the most basic forms of human creativity, conversation. Alan Wake 1 isn't all about lambasting editors, though. Its position is more nuanced than that. Alan's struggle with writer's block is, after all, only alleviated by the Dark Presence, which is to say by editorial influence. When he wrote Departure, Jagger's presence helped to focus his creative impulses, and actually turn them into something actionable. If balanced, it would be a symbiotic relationship. Just as you can't have light without darkness, you can't have creativity without focus. It's notable that when he isn't under the influence of the Dark Presence, Alan is once again incapable of writing. His creativity has no focus, and the decision paralysis prevents him from putting anything down on the page. When either party is completely without the other, neither can accomplish anything. Of course, the Dark Presence is presented as explicitly malicious, so its power is clearly the one to be curtailed more in the relationship, but the fact remains that there is a symbiosis here. That's why Alan literally embraces Jagger before he uses the clicker. It's a representation of the symbiotic relationship between writer and editor returning to homeostasis. This focus on editorial control comes through in the magic system as well. Cauldron Lake's powers only work on specific kinds of creative works. The work has to subscribe to conventional narrative structure in order for the magic to work. Or, in other words, the publisher won't back the project if they don't think it'll sell. Don't be too weird about it. Stick to the monomyth. That stuff's safe. It's obvious in their creative output that Remedy hate being forced to conform to conventional narrative structure, and when they do make games, they avoid it as much as they can. Alan Wake 2 expands this fixation on conventional narrative structure even more, but the original game ruminates on it constantly. Alan is always talking about what's necessary for the story, and the conclusion of the main campaign relies on the fact that Alan has to conform to the demands of his genre and conclude the story in a way that doesn't lead to the Dark Presence taking over the world. Hence the prisoner transfer, writing Alice out of the lake and trapping himself inside. In order for everyone else to be happy in the ending of a horror story, the protagonist must suffer. Not everyone gets out safely. The final moments of Alan Wake are so powerful, so well directed, that I want to play them on their own here so you can see what I saw back in 2011.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
Alan, wake up.
I mean, hot damn, that is a cliffhanger if I ever saw one. Plot happily wrapped up with our protagonist trapped adrift in a maelstrom of darkness. The ending works perfectly as both a complete product and a cliffhanger pushing forward into another work. This was deliberate. Sam Lake has talked in interviews about the fact that Remedy wanted to end the game in such a way that there would be room for further sequels. But this cliffhanger is just so thunderously powerful. Even with the solid wrap-up here in the ending, there's still so many questions. Who's Mr. Scratch? Where did he go? Is the Dark Presence gone? How does Alan get out of the dark place, if at all? These questions would burn for much longer than anyone expected. Alan Wake 2 was supposed to come out a lot sooner than it did, but it just didn't. It was adrift in the dark place, just as much as its titular character, and this scene was all we had to keep going on. Well, that and the 2 narrative DLCs for the original game, The Signal and The Writer. Alan Wake's 2 narrative DLCs don't actually do much of anything to follow up on the cliffhanger from the main game, and honestly that's okay. I think it was a smart choice not to try to address any of the burning questions in the fans' minds in a couple of short DLCs, and leave them until they could be addressed with a more substantial sequel. That was the plan at the time. Of course, no one could have seen the 13-year wait coming, but as far as things stood at the time of Alan Wake's release, these DLCs hit just the right transitory tone that could have bridged the gap to a planned sequel. Not everything in the 2 special episodes is great, but they do serve as solid light expansions to the main game's themes, as well as coming as close as any content will ever come to a hardcore version of the original Alan Wake gameplay experience. Before we talk about the DLCs in earnest, though, I want to talk a bit about why my footage for these DLCs looks so different from the footage of the main game. In September of 2021, Alan Wake Remastered was released, hot on the heels of the long-awaited announcement of Alan Wake 2. I actually waited until this past year to play Alan Wake Remastered, just before the release of Alan Wake 2, and I found myself with mixed feelings towards it. The original Alan Wake's age is obvious. The game looked great at the time of release, but by now, visual fidelity has far outpaced what the Xbox 360 was capable of. A remaster was well warranted, to be sure. So much about Alan Wake Remastered looks incredible. The gameplay is far more fluid, the egregious product placement from the original game has been removed, and everything is fully rendered in brilliant HD. Everything that is, except for this.
Oh my God! What's wrong with your face?
I don't know why this happened, but Alan's face specifically is just so fucking scuffed in the remaster. I don't know if it was due to having issues with converting the Ilkavili model from the first game to HD or what, but it just looks awful. I thought I'd be able to brush this off, but honestly it became very hard to take the remaster seriously for me at times, due to just how fucking scuffed this model looked. There are a good number of cutscenes in Alan Wake, and most of them involve the man himself, because he's like the protagonist, you know? And so this facial model is just popping up constantly. The HD graphics of the remaster make the issues with Alan's facial model way more pronounced, and personally I could never get past it, which is a shame because so much of this remaster is great. Maybe if you're not a super fan of the original this won't bother you, but it sure as shit bothered me. My slight qualms with the remaster aside, the DLCs for the original Alan Wake are some pretty solid content, turning into more of an action character study of Alan Wake the person than a deconstruction of horror tropes. Much of what is presented in The Signal and The Writer is clever and well executed. Some parts are ridiculous, and we will get to those, believe me, but the vast majority of these DLCs is a very tight experience. After locking himself in the dark place in Episode 6, the abyssal horror of the ocean beneath the lake breaks Alan's mind, separating his rational mind from his irrational mind, creating 2 constructs of Alan. These 2 DLCs take place entirely within the dreamscape of the dark place, and rely heavily on remixing and corrupting chunks of the original 6 episodes. At first, I felt this trope was a little cheap, but the way that Remedy handles things really nails the feel of a nightmare version of the world of Bright Falls from the main campaign. I've talked about my recontextualization test before, and the Alan Wake DLCs definitely pass that test. You're never trapped in one segment for too long, just enough to identify, hey, this is a place from Bright Falls, and then the scene will shift within moments to a completely different location. It's not as though the DLCs are bereft of novel level design either. The further you progress, the weirder things get. There are some real knockout set pieces here, especially in The Writer. The weird hamster wheel with the typewriter keys from that episode definitely sticks out in my memory, as does the boat in the sea of nothingness, and the tornado of objects you have to platform on to reach the lighthouse. The level design of these DLCs is hectic, insane, and barely coherent, which is perfectly on point for what the Dark Place is. A dream dimension where wild creativity becomes reality, even if half-formed. I mentioned earlier that the encounter design in these DLCs is also quite different from that of the main campaign. The Signal and the Writer are significantly more difficult than any of the main 6 episodes. I died more times in these 2 episodes than I think I did in my entire Nightmare Mode run of the main game. I think a lot of this is down to the environments the encounters take place in. A lot of the areas where combat happened in the main 6 episodes were wide open spaces in the woods. Here, especially in the Signal, combat is taking place in enclosed spaces with similar or even greater numbers of enemies. In classic Alan Wake combat, spacing is extremely important. You have to manage keeping your distance from all the enemies in the encounter, because even if you're burning the darkness off of one of them, they can still approach and attack you. When you're confined with the enemies, managing that spacing becomes far more difficult, leading to these comparatively difficult encounters. It's to the point that I'd honestly recommend playing the Signal especially on the difficulty below the one you played the main campaign on, unless, of course, you're looking for a deliberate challenge. The Signal and the Writer's framing also offer them an interesting way to control resource distribution that's significantly tighter than the original game. The main way you restock in the DLCs is by burning away the glowing typewritten words floating in the Dark Place. These controlled restock points that almost every player is guaranteed to see allow Remedy to control the distribution of resources much more tightly. In the main campaign, exploring could yield a number of resources that put you pretty comfortably ahead of the enemy. Here, each word cache stocks you with just enough to get by to the next one, so there'll be some real resource-related tension here that wasn't there for the main 6 episodes. These 2 DLCs delve into different thematic territory from the main game as well, and I find it to be a little bit more interesting than the writer versus editor conflict of the main story. The DLC's main thematic focus is what myself and some of my other creative friends call the Void. For those who've never experienced it, the Void is a state of mind a person inhabits shortly after finishing their work on a creative project. A purposeless malaise that follows the release of the thing you worked so hard on for so long. I always feel when I'm working on a creative endeavor like this will be the one that finally fulfills me. I get invested and log hour after hour, working until it's finally done, and I'm as close to satisfied with it as I'll be. And then, when it's over, I'm inevitably left feeling empty. The level of fulfillment you expect never really comes through. That feeling is the Void. Alan Wake is a series about creativity and the creative experience, and a major part of that experience is the Void. The Signal and the Writer represent Alan's Void after having written Departure. Though, of course, that Void takes on violent and monstrous proportions due to the powers of the Dark Place. Alan actually has a polemic directly addressing this theme at the beginning of the Signal.
After the completion of any difficult undertaking, there are mixed emotions. Accomplishment and relief. Sadness, depression. For a while, everything was about the work. Like an illness, it consumed you, changed you. You locked yourself away from the world to do it, and now you need to recover. Learn to live without it. Find a way to crack open the door and let the light back in.
I mean, say what you will about the original Alan Wake's writing, but at least it's clear. Alan Wake broadly addresses themes of the Void throughout its runtime, actually. A big part of what inspired the story of the original game was the team at Remedy's difficulty with creating a follow-up to Max Payne 2. Now, after having spent so long working on Alan Wake while it was in development hell, we see that Void taking shape again. I don't think the Void has ever made me feel quite as depressed as it makes Alan in the game, but I definitely understand the feeling of malaise and the feeling of being a hack that often comes along with it. It's hard to end a creative endeavor and not immediately be ready to start another one up, because you feel like it was just a fluke, a happy accident. A lot of the Signal especially is devoted to Alan feeling like he's a hack, and has never accomplished anything, despite that being obviously untrue. I mean, the Alex Casey books are certainly not meant to be the great American novel, but they were his creative works, and they were enjoyed by a massive number of people. Just because you're not the next John Steinbeck doesn't mean that everything you've ever made is worthless. The thing is, though, the Void will tell you that, and it's a convincing fucker. It's notable that the villain in these DLCs is no longer an editorial force, but Alan's own creativity made manifest. Having finished Departure, he literally feels like he's been divorced from his ability to create and write, just like he did after killing off Alex Casey. This time, though, that new writer's block is a lot more dangerous, on account of the Dark Place's ability to make Alan's beliefs a reality. I can't tell you how often I feel this way. Whenever I'm not actively proving to myself and others that I have value as an artist, I immediately begin to feel as though I never was one to begin with, and I might as well quit now. Those thoughts can very quickly lead you to more that suggest that if you don't have any value, then why do these people seem to keep hanging around you and care about you? Have you ever felt like everyone in your life secretly hates you, or perhaps only tolerates your presence out of some kind of misplaced obligation? I sure have, and apparently Alan Wake has too, because that's basically what the writer is all about. If the DLCs are about defeating the Void, then this specific aspect of it is the focus of the second special episode. Some people actually point to this DLC as being evidence that Alan is a bad person and was abusing Alice, but I don't think that interpretation holds true. It's important to remember in these DLCs that the enemy is Alan's own mind. He's the one coming up with this shit, and none of it is objective fact. Zane even throws Alan some good memories from his times with Alice, to remind him that what he's cooking up here isn't necessarily the whole truth. Sure, Alan isn't a great guy, but he's not a monster either. He's a person, a deeply flawed one, sure, but so is everyone else. There are some real knockout scenes that address these intrusive thoughts of Alan's, like the one with Hartman, but unfortunately, while a lot of the writer's resonant commentary on rejecting intrusive thoughts, it doesn't quite stick the landing. Throughout both DLCs, Alan is guided by a fictional version of Barry that he conjures up from his imagination, and eventually this culminates in one of the dumbest possible moments for the entire series, the Barry boss fight. Everyone and their mother has talked about how dumb this fight is, and that's true, but I do see where Remedy was coming from with it. Barry is the person who stuck by Alan the most, and if we're going to follow through on the writer's themes, this fight does actually make sense. Killing a version of Barry that confirms all of Alan's worst intrusive thoughts about his best friend isn't a horrible idea on paper. The thing is, though, Barry is an inherently ridiculous character. He's a comedy relief sidekick with a caricature New York accent, and that doesn't exactly lead to a very climactic final encounter. As emotionally resonant as this scene could have been in theory, Barry's existence as a character completely undercuts it. So, after what are some of the best parts of Alan Wake 1, we finish off with a comedy pratfall. Still, despite the fact that the Barry fight doesn't really work, the signal and the writer are, broadly speaking, great follow-ups to the main campaign. Alan Wake as a package is tight, and I love it to death. These DLCs were supposed to bridge the gap over to Alan Wake 2, and as I said, I think they would have served that purpose very well had Alan Wake 2 dropped when it was supposed to, more like 10 years ago instead of 13. We didn't get Alan Wake 2 after the original game, though. Instead, we got this. After the release of Alan Wake, a sequel was always planned. The cliffhanger was too strong not to follow up on, and fans of the game were desperate for any kind of progression of Alan's narrative. Unfortunately, that's not what they got. Instead of Alan Wake 2, we got Alan Wake's American Nightmare. American Nightmare is just awful. There's no sugarcoating it. The game sucks. It's vapid, it's stupid, and it completely waters down the mechanics of the original Alan Wake to create a bland slurry that bears almost no resemblance to the main game's gameplay. This is what makes it so incredibly frustrating for me to say that while American Nightmare is schlock of the highest order, just an absolute dog turd of a game, it's also shockingly important to the canon. American Nightmare actually explains how the powers of the Dark Place beneath Cauldron Lake work better than any other piece of Alan Wake media. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to your personal taste, but that is one of the major objectives of American Nightmare. It's one of the many stories that Alan wrote in an attempt to escape. While all signs seem to point to American Nightmare being completely non-canonical, it actually is. There's a line in Alan Wake 2 that directly references it.
This has gone on long enough. This and our Night Springs was a nice distraction.
The looping nature of American Nightmare and the idea of creativity creating overlaps with the real world is, for what it's worth, very similar to how the Dark Place functions in Alan Wake 2. This, however, is all lore. Lore is great, I love it, and I'm gonna talk a lot more about how much I love it when we talk about Control. That said, lore alone is not enough to make a good game, or a good narrative. What then is American Nightmare's real narrative? Next to nothing would be the answer. It's 3 repeating levels in which Alan performs meaningless tasks to fight Mr. Scratch. Well, that and interact with 3 cardboard cutout hot chick characters who are about as deep as puddles and have voice performances and dialogue to match. I legitimately don't even remember their names, and I'm writing this only a week or so after finishing my playthrough for the video. Now, some of the corniness and shittiness of the dialogue could be a meta-commentary on the fact that the story is framed as an episode of Night Springs, Remedy's in-universe Twilight Zone parody. This style could be trying to mimic the feel of a low-budget, schlocky sci-fi show. Or it could just be genuine incompetence. I really honestly can't tell, and that is a serious problem. In the original Alan Wake, Alan's pulpy, writerly narration was part of the story. It was a feature, not a bug. There's only so far that meta-commentary can be stretched to cover up for shittiness of writing. Remedy found that point, and far surpassed it in the making of American Nightmare. You can tell the cast knew it, too. Matthew Peretta especially, a prolific voice actor with Remedy, seriously feels like he's phoning in his performances as both Alan and Mr. Scratch. Even the game's manuscript pages are way more poorly written. Where the manuscript of the original game was a way of giving foresight to future events and fleshing out the world and characters, the manuscript here is mostly just random musings of Alan's about the Dark Place, and whatever happened after the first game. If the manuscript is supposed to be the story being brought to life by Cauldron Lake, this one has almost no bearing on what happens in American Nightmare, and it barely tells a story at all. Which is probably because nothing really happens in American Nightmare. It's empty, a narrative void. There's just nothing here. So what about from a gameplay perspective? The game that exists to have an Alan Wake arcade mode must represent some kind of great combat challenge, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. The mechanics of Alan Wake are butchered in American Nightmare. The Taken's darkness shields produced a unique degree of tension in Alan Wake's gameplay. Here, the darkness burns off even the most powerful enemies faster than ever, and the flashlight recharges almost instantaneously. I legitimately don't think I used a battery one time in American Nightmare. There's just no tension to the combat anymore. Resource management is null and void. I mean, it was never really difficult in the original game, but here there are ammo boxes every 5 feet or so that give you a full reload. There's a couple new enemy types, but they don't even have the Taken's trademark darkness shields at all, making them firstly feel out of step with the game's main mechanic, and secondly, atrociously easy to defeat. It even has the gall to think it could get away with putting in a Remedy musical level. This half-baked, unworthy follow-up thought it could capitalize on one of the best moments of the original game. I mean, sure, Balance Slays the Demon is an absolute banger of a track. That's absolutely true. The old gods are still firing on all cylinders here. I just wish they actually gave me enough time to appreciate the damn thing, and the combat surrounding it wasn't so terrible. Like the rest of American Nightmare, it tries to ape a great scene from the original game, but without devoting anywhere near as much time and effort to the set piece as that game did. I'm sorry to say, but this is an open and shut case. Balance Slays the Demon comes right in at number 5 on the Remedy musical level ranking list, and it's a distant 5th. Also, it doesn't qualify, but the Psycho song is absolutely hilarious, and as much as I hate American Nightmare with a burning, fiery passion, I'll never not love the awkward as fuck FMV of Ilkavilli dancing to "You Know That I'm a Psycho!" I mean, look at him go!
I told you I'm a psycho. Really? I'm a psycho.
Top tier comedy. The happy song is S tier, the only bright spot in an absolutely god-awful game. Unfortunately, it's a Poets of the Fall song and not an Old Gods of Asgard song, so it's officially disqualified. Sorry, American Nightmare. So by now you might be thinking, Andy, sure, I get it. American Nightmare is bad. The game has no redeeming qualities and makes you feel like you just wasted 3 hours of your life, but why do you have so much hatred for this game? It's a shitty little Xbox Live Arcade title that basically no one has ever played and has been forgotten by those who have. Well, let me explain to you. American Nightmare was the last piece of Alan Wake content we got. For 12 years, this was all we had. This slapdash, half-baked, nearly incomprehensible waste of hard drive space. I think that context is key to understanding why I personally have such a disproportionately huge hate boner for this game. This waste of space was Alan Wake 2 for a long time, and it seemed like it was going to be forever. That impression was only compounded when years went by and Quantum Break was announced, released, and flopped with nary a mention of Alan Wake 2. A whole console generation passed. Nothing. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, something in the dark place finally shifted. I wasn't always a true believer in Control. When I first heard it announced, I actually resented it because I thought it represented the final nail in the coffin for the possibility of Alan Wake 2. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was the release of the AWE expansion that actually convinced me to buy and play through the game. The piece of content that finally at long last confirmed Alan Wake 2. Control is basically the mission statement for the RCU. It's the title that codifies a lot of how the universe works, and the ways in which things are connected. Much of Control's runtime is dedicated to explaining and exploring these concepts, and to that end, most of its actual narrative is very utilitarian. Lots of go here, fix this, that sort of thing. There is some underlying drama with Jessie's search for her brother Dylan, but all of that is very much playing second fiddle to the more important task of codifying the RCU's core concepts. Control centers around the titular Federal Bureau of Control, a secret government agency that finds and contains all of the paranatural phenomena to prevent the chaos they would cause if cut loose in the world. It's an adaptation of the SCP Foundation, which in and of itself is a very interesting concept. It's rare to see something like collaborative web fiction be leveraged in this way, adapted into a high-budget project like this. Something like the SCP Foundation only exists because a bunch of people on the internet thought it would be neat to make. Control doesn't follow SCP's format exactly, but it's very similar. Mundane objects which gain strange and dangerous abilities. SCP, however, was more of a sci-fi horror concept, whereas Control actually leans a lot closer to sci-fi comedy, despite what the game's intro might have you believe. Sure, Control does have serious elements, and takes itself seriously as a story, but there's a comedic undercurrent that flows through the entire game. The Bureau is an intensely weird place, but no one there seems to know that. Or perhaps they've all been around the weirdness so long that it doesn't even register to them anymore, leading to plenty of opportunities for deadpan or absurdist humor, like this line from Langston.
Do you like working at the FBC?
Sure. I mean, yeah, the drama's a bit much, but I get better benefits here than I would over at the Postal Service. I checked. Better healthcare.
This is actually one of my favorite tropes in sci-fi and fantasy, the bizarre and supernatural being treated with utter mundanity. I think my love of this trope traces itself back to when I read Percy Jackson as a kid. Those stories are all full of the absolutely batshit Greek pantheon being treated like everyday office workers and whatnot. Look at Ahti the janitor, for example. Ahti is something of a mascot for the RCU now, appearing in both Control and Alan Wake 2, and while he appears as a janitor, he is assuredly so much more than just that. When she arrives on the scene, he tells Jessie that she's applying to be the janitor's assistant, a role which everyone else in the Bureau curiously calls the director for whatever reason. Ahti is almost certainly some kind of representative of the board, or some other paranatural intelligence, but his only way of communicating his powerful paranatural abilities is through the mundane language of a janitor's job. This kind of thing seems straight out of Percy Jackson, a story where Charon, the ferryman to the underworld, appears as a desk clerk, or Poseidon as a surfer dude in a Hawaiian shirt. This presentation undercuts the grandiosity of the characters and concepts present, but somehow also underlines it. It seems to suggest that for an entity to appear in this mundane of a guise while dealing with phenomena so strange, otherworldly, and dangerous, they must be much more strange, otherworldly, and dangerous themselves. This stuff is pervasive in Control, and it helps lend it a very unique and fluctuating tone. I said that Control is largely concerned with codifying the Remedy versus core concepts, and to my mind there are three that you really need to know moving forward with all of Remedy's future work. OOPs, Altered Items, and AWEs. Objects of Power, or OOPs, are items that have gained strange and supernatural abilities that can be bound to and granted to para-utilitarians, like Jesse or Alan. The service weapon that Jesse uses throughout Control is a perfect example of the OOP, as is the clicker from Alan Wake. Altered items, then, are items with strange and completely uncontrollable abilities, or paranatural significance. They can range from as harmless as one of Alan's manuscript pages to as potent as an anchor that uncontrollably duplicates objects. AWEs, or Altered World Events, are paranatural happenings within the world. So, for example, say a writer wrote a book, and then, due to a paranatural phenomenon, that book came true. That would be an AWE. AWE 35, to be more specific. By now you're probably noticing that there's a lot of very specific minutiae to Control's world, and that's because while the narrative itself isn't much to sneeze at, the real joy in Control is the lore. Lore is absolutely tumbling off the shelves in Control, in tidbits both consequential and inconsequential. The sheer number of in-game documents is mind-boggling. You're stumbling across a new file every minute in some areas, and if you took the time to read through all of them, it could easily add hours to your run-through. Files about different altered items in the Bureau, or radio shows about paranatural phenomena across the country, or even weird shit like this.
Since little Topher is taking a trip with his father into the world outside our wonderful bureau, I think it's a good time to talk about secrets. Who can tell me what a secret is?
It's something you hide from everyone so they don't get scared.
Partially correct, Topher. A secret is something you don't tell anyone outside the bureau. Because people outside the Bureau
aren't ready for the truth of reality.
Very good. When you tell someone a secret, you're hurting their brains very badly. Now, let's review what exactly is or isn't a secret. First, we have a rainbow. Secret or not secret?
Not secret.
Correct. And the true version of rainbows?
Secret.
Correct. Cats?
Not secret.
Correct. And the Alpine Chimera?
Not secret.
Topher. Too many slip-ups and your father will have to go on vacation without you. You don't want to end up like Meg, do you?
What? What happened to Meg?
I'm not allowed to go outside anymore.
Correct.
Not all of the stuff in Control is stellar, but enough of it is enjoyable enough to read and watch that it makes up the bulk of your experience with the game. Even with the dud documents, the sheer quantity of creativity on display in the game is staggering. I think that alone is worthy of some praise. This all speaks to Control's paramount objective of establishing the universe, or potentially multiverse, and it does so very well. By the time you're 10 or so hours into Control, if you don't at least understand the basics of how the RCU works, you weren't paying attention. Control is a very different type of action game than Alan Wake, in part due to the protagonist. Alan was always kind of clumsy, and part of that was due to the game just not having the best physics, but the other part was intentional. Alan was never an action hero. He was a hard-drinking rich guy, and so he couldn't really run or jump very well. Jesse, in contrast, is a literal superhuman, one of the strongest ever recorded in the entire history of the FBC, in fact. So it makes a lot of sense that she's a lot more competent and fluid as a player avatar. I've heard a lot of people say that Jesse is unrelatable and unrealistic for not being more astounded by the bizarre world of the FBC and the oldest house, and I actually think that's one of her greatest advantages as a protagonist. Jesse is at home with the supernatural. She's lived most of her life bonded to a paranatural resonance. This shit isn't news to her. Sure, it might be weird to a first-time player for a little while, but as her backstory is revealed, her demeanor is recontextualized. She hasn't been thrust into a strange new world. She's been living in that world longer than most of the FBC's veteran staff. This is where she's always belonged in life, and she says as much in the game. The RCU is a very deliberately strange world, and Jesse's peculiarity as a protagonist is part of that weirdness. The one thing that's not particularly weird about Control is its gameplay. I still find it to be pretty enjoyable, but it doesn't have that same unique feel that Alan Wake's did. The flashlight there was an iconic and unique touch to the gameplay that made what would otherwise be a pretty bog-standard third-person shooter feel a lot more tense and unique. Alan Wake's combat was very methodical and put a lot of emphasis on spacing-based strategy. Control's various supernatural abilities do give it that unique style of gameplay, but as a consequence of having to unlock them, it will take longer to show that to you. Once you've upgraded launch enough and gotten access to levitate from the Benikoff TV, Control will make you feel like a proper para-utilitarian, but reaching that level of power takes more than half the game. This makes sense from a power advancement curve perspective, but this means that a lot of your time with Control is spent playing what feels like a very standard third-person shooter gameplay-wise. It's a lot more fast-paced and frenetic than something like Alan Wake, and the sound design is spectacular, which goes a long way to improve the experience. But I hear about a lot of people falling off of Control, and I think that's because for much of its runtime, it doesn't really have that X-factor to its gameplay to match its stellar setting and lore. It's a shame, too, because once you do actually reach the apex of Jesse's power, Control's combat becomes very spectacular. The less you're relying on the service weapon, and the more you're sprinting and floating around while blasting enemies with 3 to 4 launched objects at a time, the more enjoyable Control becomes. The feeling of power you get from absolutely demolishing some hiss with a fucking forklift is just second to none. But for much of the game's runtime, your ability to do so will be significantly diminished. Control also pioneers what I would call Remedy's modern visual style. Beginning with Control and continued in Alan Wake 2, a deliberate effort is made to tie Remedy's games together through specific visual flourishes, the most frequent one being this overlay effect that happens with the hotline calls. Whenever you receive a new one, an FMV fades in over the world like a filter. This effect will appear throughout both Control and Alan Wake 2 as a way to represent paranatural phenomena overlapping with the real world. The chapter titles in Alan Wake 2 also bear a striking resemblance to the area titles that are established here in Control, that austere block text superimposed over the game world. Smaller touches like these help Alan Wake 2 and Control feel more like they're part of the same creative unit, while still retaining their own individual creative identities. In addition to these new flourishes, the studio's penchant for mixed media approaches has reached a new high here. In Alan Wake, there were some light live-action elements with things like the Night Springs episodes or Alan's rantings on the TV, but here, live-action components are a full-fledged part of the game. Anytime you find a lore-related video file in the game world, those files are completely live-action FMVs. There are entire characters in Control, like Casper Darling, played by Alan Wake's voice actor Matthew Peretta, who appear only in live action and have no in-game model at all. This choice is a major part of Remedy's modern visual style, and they use it specifically because of its ability to drag players kicking and screaming into the uncanny valley. When most of the game is rendered in high-definition animation, the live-action segments can seem almost otherworldly. And I think that's exactly the idea. It's worth noting that the hotline is a device intended for communication with paranatural entities. Every character in Control that's shown in live action is effectively a paranatural phenomenon. Dr. Darling is scattered to the winds of the universe, Director Trench is dead, as is Marshall in the Foundation DLC. The only character that breaks with this is the board, which appears as an inverted black pyramid rendered in the game's engine. And perhaps that's to suggest that they're trying to take on a form that's more comprehensible to the minds of the characters. Regardless, this use of live action alongside in-game animation is a pretty bold direction for the studio to take, as similar creative decisions have been derided in the past. Remedy's outing before Control, Quantum Break, isn't officially part of the RCU, but it was far more involved in the mixed media approach. Quantum Break had a full TV show that ran in parallel with the game, and I think that direction was a little too far for gamers to accept. Control finally manages to strike a nice balance, using its live-action bits to represent parts of the game's world that are supposed to be weird and uncanny. Instead of sticking out like a sore thumb, they fit in right alongside the rest of the weird shit in Control's world, adding to the experience instead of detracting from it. Now that they've struck this balance, Remedy will take full advantage of it in Alan Wake 2. But here in Control, things are handled quite deftly as well on the live-action front. As weird as Control is, I don't really think it went as far as it could or should have. Look at the setting, for example. The Oldest House is an eternal, ever-shifting building with many secrets, but there really isn't that much of it that feels like it's from outside of our world. There are some real awe-inspiring moments in The Oldest House, like when you first step out into the quarry, and you see the full extra-dimensional sky intruding upon the maintenance sector, or the molded-over area beneath research where the giant boss monster resides. But those moments are the exception, not the rule. For a building that's described as though it's a character unto itself, The Oldest House doesn't really feel like it. So much of the building is just a standard, brutalist office building, and I can't help but feel that that's a missed opportunity for the game. Building shifts are a concept that gets discussed in many of the game's notes and files, but almost never actually happen within the game. I wish there had been some kind of mechanic that helped involve the shifting nature of The Oldest House in a more active way, although I certainly understand that it would be extremely complicated and costly to implement. The thing is though, Alan Wake 2 does make me think that Remedy could find a way to make something like this work. I look forward to a Control 2, and I hope that Remedy manages to find a way to make The Oldest House feel a little more like the character that the game makes it out to be. Speaking of those interesting otherworldly elements though, it's time to rank Control's Remedy musical level, the Ashtray Maze. The Ashtray Maze is one of the last set pieces that you'll work your way through in Control, and it really does show off the best of what the game has to offer. By the time you're running through it, Jessie will be at the apex of her powers, at least as far as the main game is concerned. The maze is an incredible set piece, and it shows off the best of what The Oldest House could have been, while also letting you feel badass by blasting away hiss left and right with your paranatural abilities. As a song, Take Control is a certified banger, though not quite as great as Children of the Elder God in my opinion. What makes the Ashtray Maze a particularly great Remedy musical level though, is the fact that it paces itself with the music. The way the maze shifts and you progress through it is designed around the flow of the track, and that makes it feel incredible, even if I don't personally love Control's combat as much as other games in this video. I put it at number 4 on the list. Control is a great game. I don't love it as much as Alan Wake, but I don't think I was ever going to love a game that wasn't Alan Wake 2 with the same fervency that I love Alan Wake 1. It does a great job of establishing the RCU and its new style, while also being a pretty solid game in its own right, but the gameplay itself is just not quite as unique or interesting to me as Alan Wake's. I love the weird world and the lore, and I'm happy to be here, but I feel as though we've only scratched the surface with Control, a sentiment that Remedy themselves seems to share. The Foundation is a direct narrative expansion to Control. The second expansion, AWE, will begin to pivot away from The Oldest House, the hiss, and the board as its main subjects, so this is our last chance to really delve deep into the lore of Control specifically. Taking us deep into The Oldest House, all the way down to where Ahti went on his vacation in the main game. This is a fascinating concept to me from the start. What would the oldest, most ancient part of The Oldest House look like? So many questions will be running through your mind as you begin your journey into the Foundation, and unfortunately, I feel that very few of them will actually be paid off. There are two major locations you play in during the DLC, one interesting and the other not so much. The Foundation itself is unfortunately pretty much just a cave system. I was expecting more interesting thresholds, something along the lines of the quarry in the main game's map, but that wasn't quite delivered here. I don't know what it was that would have wowed me here, but I just hoped that the foundation of the oldest house, a sentient, abstract building with a will of its own, would be something a little bit more interesting than a cave system with some crystals growing in it. Where the Foundation does start to present some more interesting level design is in its use of the astral plane. The astral plane in the main campaign was pretty much just a white void controlled by the board, where you would be taught about the new abilities Jesse had gained from cleansed objects of power. A training ground of sorts. With the arrival of the Hiss invasion, though, the astral plane has begun to bleed through into the foundation of the oldest house. This is because Marshall damaged an important artifact called the Nail, a sort of counterpart to the inverted black pyramid controlled/inhabited by the board. The Nail maintained the oldest house's connection to the astral plane without allowing the two dimensions to intermingle in ways that could be problematic, and now the plane threatens to bleed over into the entire material plane. The bleeding creates these thresholds in the Foundation that are just white voids, conspicuously placed where rooms used to be. It's pretty shocking when you first encounter it. Jesse actually falls directly through the floor into the astral plane, where you never would have expected it. There's even a great bit in one part of the Foundation where a bathroom was suddenly supplanted by the astral plane. Toilets and paper and office workers alike floating in the void amidst the black rock. Macabre, sure, but a funny implication of the disaster nonetheless. Unfortunately, while the Foundation does expand upon the lore and the player's understanding of the FBC and the board, it doesn't feel very consequential as an experience. The main and most interesting takeaway from the Foundation is that the board is not to be trusted. Players may have had their reservations before, especially if they played through the Fridge Duty side quest in the main campaign, but the Foundation explicitly confirms this. The board needlessly withholds powers from Jessie for some unspecified reason, perhaps to prevent her from becoming too powerful, or to keep her dependent on their power. As you cleanse the Nail's different points, Jessie will meet with the former again, this time peacefully. She can only partially understand its speech, possibly because the board is directly preventing her from communicating with it to stop her from hearing any kind of counter-narrative. They even threaten to kill Jessie when she obtains the second power against their wishes, only to anxiously walk that threat back when they realize that perhaps they went too far in asserting their control over her. Naturally, Jessie doesn't take kindly to this and says as much. The thing is, though, that's kinda where the Foundation stops with all of it. They lay these seeds for a potential conflict with the board, which I assume will be important to a later Control title, but there's no real payoff and no real relation to this conflict in the actual actions you're performing in the plot. It feels like you're just doing busy work, and then the DLC kind of just ends with a relatively anticlimactic boss fight with a Hiss-infected Marshall. Not much of anything happens in the Foundation, which makes the experience feel kind of ancillary to Control as a title. That's not to say that the Foundation is garbage on the level of American Nightmare or anything. If you like Control's gameplay, you will have fun with it. It's tough, considerably harder than the main campaign, so if harder combat is what you're looking for, then this will scratch that itch. It just doesn't really deliver on what I wanted out of more Control content. There's an issue that I feel is somewhat fundamental to Control as an IP that shines through in the Foundation. The world of Control officially feels too weird for its own good here. Let me explain what I mean. Game development is an expensive process, and the more complicated your environments and ideas become, the more expensive that process is. When I think the foundation of the oldest house, my mind begins to race with possibilities that ultimately are far too complicated and frankly too expensive to put in the game. I don't know what the solution is here, aside from completely divorcing Remedy from the profit motive. But since that's not happening anytime soon, what's to be done here? Perhaps I need to temper my own expectations a little more. Again, this content isn't bad, it's just kind of forgettable, and nowhere near as out there as I had hoped it might be. The Foundation also highlights another issue with Control that didn't shine through as much in the main game. It focuses a lot on the character of Helen Marshall, A lot more so than the story had focused on pretty much anyone except Jesse and Dylan. Control's characters, aside from the lovable Emily Pope, whom I will spare from all harm and slander, and if you try anything you'll have to go through me, are just not as interesting as the lore that surrounds them. They're at their best when they provide you with a quest, any strictly necessary expository dialogue, a little dash of personality, and very little else, allowing you to explore and discover the universe mostly for yourself. Marshall in this DLC fills a role similar to Director Trench in the main game, resident hotline info dumper, which is fine. The climax of the whole DLC, though, predicates itself on your caring about Helen Marshall as a character, which I think is a bridge too far, at least from my perspective. Her screen time in the main campaign is limited and curt, and by the time you get to the Foundation DLC, she's already dead. Jesse is grief-stricken when you find out that she's been taken by the Hiss, and the player will just not see the reason for it. Marshall isn't interesting. She didn't do much of anything to establish a strong presence in the story. Then you just kill her and boom, DLC done. No grand resolution, no major changes to the status quo, just another section of the oldest house cleared of the Hiss. That's fine and all, but it's not great. And that is the problem at the foundation of the Foundation. Play it if you want, but I really don't think most people would regret skipping it. I, for one, was just waiting the entire time for the DLC that I was actually excited to play. I'll admit one thing right off the bat here. I'm deeply biased in favor of the AWE DLC, in much the same way that I think any Alan Wake superfan would be. It was no secret very early on that AWE was a direct crossover with Alan Wake, the logo literally being a split half and half between Alan Wake and Control. But upon completing the DLC, players realized it was bigger than that. A full-on confirmation that Alan Wake 2 was coming, after 10 long years of waiting. For players who had been waiting that long to hear any word about Alan, the Dark Place, and all the characters of the original game, AWE was a delight to behold. It begins, amazingly, with a message from the man himself. Walking towards the sector elevator that takes Jesse between the different areas of the oldest house, you'll be greeted by a hotline call from none other than Alan Wake, hammering away at his typewriter to send a message across realities to his newest protagonist, Jesse Faden. After years of trying to write himself out of the Dark Place, Alan has finally begun trying to put those on the outside into situations where they might be able to pull him out. At the time of release, this completely reframed the entirety of Control. The entire Hiss invasion and Jesse's role in it are essentially revealed to have been written by Alan in the Dark Place, an AWE he created to build a new hero who might be able to get him out of his prison. It's hard to overstate as a huge fan of Alan Wake just how it felt to see Alan pop up in the hotline vision for the first time during the AWE DLC. It was one of the most vindicating experiences I've had in gaming, a feeling like the wait was actually worth it for once. Usually once a game enters development hell, it's gone for good, but here was honest-to-God proof that Alan Wake as a franchise still existed and still had potential. Little did Alan's ardent fans know, seeing him alone wouldn't be the last update they got about Alan before the DLC was through. Aside from just the connection to Alan Wake though, AWE is a lot more interesting than the Foundation from a Control-specific perspective as well. The focus of the DLC is in the name, AWEs. The main campaign saw a lot of mention of AWEs and a few files about them scattered throughout the world, but ultimately things were a lot more focused on altered items and OOPs there. Jesse, here, is exploring the long-abandoned FBC investigations sector, the department of the FBC that was devoted to investigating and dealing with AWEs. Because of this, you'll actually wind up moving through 3 major areas, each devoted to a different AWE that the FBC dealt with in the past. The sector's been overrun by the Hiss, just like every other part of the building. But interestingly enough, this sector was abandoned long before, on account of a severe containment breach involving one Dr. Emil Hartman. That's right, Dr. Hartman is the main villain here, although he's looking a bit worse for wear.
God!
So not only is Alan guiding Jesse through the DLC, she's being stalked by the ironic comeuppance of his most wormy shitbag villain. Unfortunately, like pretty much all of Control, I don't think the AWE DLC goes as far as it could have with the ideas it presents. Hartman is infested with both the Hiss and the Dark Presence. That's why he's all emaciated and inside out. The two resonances interacting within him literally tore his body apart as they tried to figure out how to cohabitate with one another. This, combined with the use of scattered emergency lights to burn away pools of the Dark Presence, suggested to me that we would get to see more Hiss-Dark Presence hybrid creatures. That promise, unfortunately, goes completely unfulfilled in the AWE DLC. I mean, hell, we don't even see any normal Taken mixed in with the standard Hiss. How cool and dynamic would it have been to have combat encounters where Jessie is beset by slower moving but more resilient Taken enemies that she had to burn the darkness off of with an emergency light, while also dealing with the standard Hiss baddies, who are much more aggressive but considerably more fragile. I mean, hell, they wouldn't have even had to come up with new enemy concepts. They could have just designed the Taken the same way they were designed in the original Alan Wake, and it would have worked just fine. Control's DLCs suffer pretty severely from this categorical refusal to vary the gameplay in any way. And it's especially disappointing here, because the possibilities were literally gift-wrapped for the creative team by the very narrative conceit of this new piece of content. That's not to say that there's nothing at all new or interesting about AWE gameplay-wise, just that it didn't go as far as it could or should have. The DLC has a new weapon form for the service weapon, and a new type of Hiss, the Flying Soldiers, which is already a lot further than the Foundation went to iterate upon Control's gameplay. They don't turn the game on its head or anything, but they are new gameplay utilities that breathe a little new life into Control's loop. I think the battles with the Hartman thing are actually the most interesting that Control's combat ever gets. Each encounter is sort of a puzzle and a combat encounter, usually being beset by Hiss and the incredibly deadly Hartman thing, as well as the Dark Presence itself, which causes Jessie's paranatural energy to drain. You have to try to evade the enemies while figuring out how to turn the lights back on. Each encounter is a little bit different from one another, and they provide a nice change of pace from the standard Control gameplay loop. It's just barely not enough, though. It's hard because I really wanted to unreservedly love the AWE DLC. I'm the exact target audience for this piece of content, and there's a lot about it that I did find to love. The Alan Wake connections are fantastically done, and draw some interesting new implications about the universe as it stands. But there are just too many missed opportunities in this DLC for me to fully love it. It's ultimately just alright, again. Better than the Foundation, but nothing that's gonna blow you away. This is pretty much Control's entire MO. There's so much here to like and even love, but it never really delivers fully. It always feels like there's something missing, some detail or piece out of place that could have made Control an absolute 10 out of 10, when instead it's more like a 7. The Northlight engine is beautiful, the chaos is enthralling, but never does the game actually take that step beyond, up to a masterpiece level. Perhaps in a Control 2, the FBC can be utilized to its fullest potential. As it stands though, my favorite part of the AWE DLC is the end. Not in a negative way, but in a positive way. After years of hearing neither hide nor hair of Alan Wake 2, not only do we have a crossover here, but the final cutscene of AWE brings much, much more than that. Confirmation.
Ma'am, I'm getting something on my terminal here, an AWE alert from Bright Falls, Washington. But it might be a glitch. The date's all wrong, a couple of years in the future. And we're in lockdown, there shouldn't be any incoming signals.
Maybe it was active before we went into lockdown? Are there agents on site?
Let me check. Agent Estevez is the field agent in charge of monitoring the site, so she should be there to let us know if the situation has been through any major changes recently.
Things set in motion. If the alarm's true, then so is the reason for the alarm. The effect must follow the cause. It's happening again. A return. You have been warned.
Once again, it's hard to overstate just how mind-blowing this scene was to me. I mean, this was it. This was confirmation after 12 years that Alan Wake 2 was, finally, officially, actually on its way. Alan Wake fans tore this brief teaser apart on release, and in the intervening years. It was an honest-to-God revelation that revived a half-dead community. That's why, even though there are aspects to Control that don't live up to what they could have been, the game still managed to carve out its little place in my heart. Without the substantial success of Control, I seriously doubt that Alan Wake 2 would ever have gotten finished. Was it quite as effective to me as Alan Wake was? Absolutely not. Was it also integral to not only the revival of Alan Wake, but the expansion of its universe and lore? Also yes. And as such, I can't ever dismiss it fully. If you love Alan Wake 2, you have to acknowledge that you owe a massive debt to Control. Masterpiece or not. The AWE DLC was a confirmation that we never thought would come. Alan Wake 2 was in fact in development, and only 2 years away as it turned out. We wound up waiting a little longer than we expected with the game releasing in 2023, but Remedy was true to their teaser. Against all odds, Alan Wake 2 does exist, and has now been released. I was nervous there would be no way Alan Wake 2 could stack up to the hype that I had built for it in 13 years of waiting, but thankfully, not only did the game meet my expectations, I think it's Remedy's most ambitious title to date. Alan Wake 2 is a post-structuralist roller coaster of epic proportions, to an extent that no other Remedy title is matched. Where much of Remedy's work takes direct influence from other sources, Alan Wake 2 feels much more like its own thing, especially more so than the original game. It also takes advantage of its status as a video game in numerous interesting ways to tell its story in a way only a video game could really tell it. The one major way that Alan Wake 2 isn't mind-bending is in terms of its mechanics, like the other Remedy titles. Remedy games have never been mechanically revolutionary. Alan Wake 2 uses pretty standard survival horror mechanics to the point where I actually got to have a good laugh during the Game Awards when Remedy first revealed gameplay footage. The stream flooded with comments from what I can only assume were younger members of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, accusing the game of copying Resident Evil 4 Remake. I don't know if any of them understood the full irony of this accusation. I mean, yes, in the loosest sense, you could say that Alan Wake 2 is a Resident Evil 4 clone. In the same sense that every single third-person shooter released after 2005 is a Resident Evil 4 clone, including the literal clone that is RE4 Remake. I guess we've finally reached the point of generational divide, where there are teen and young adult gamers who don't really understand just how much RE4 completely redefined game design. Thanks for making me feel like an old man, baby zoomers. As far as survival horror titles go though, Alan Wake 2 is a pretty tame experience. It's probably the least hardcore survival horror game I've played, to be honest, but that's okay. Being challenging isn't Alan Wake 2's primary goal as a work, so the fact that its nightmare mode is probably only a little more difficult than Resident Evil 1 on easy makes sense. Don't get me wrong, resource management is much more of a consideration than it ever was in the original game, but you'll always have a pretty comfortable amount of materials to get by with, even on the hardest difficulties. People coming to this game for a real, hardcore survival horror experience have joined the cult of the wrong tree. Alan Wake 2 is first and foremost a narrative experience, so it's designed in such a way that you'll never really get hard stuck like you might in a Resident Evil game. The biggest downside of Alan Wake 2 using these survival horror mechanics is that they do kind of water down one of the most unique aspects of the original game. In Alan Wake 1, combat was pretty standard by most metrics, but the process of using the flashlight to burn off the enemy's darkness shield added a necessary and tension-heightening twist to its combat. Instead of just thinking about shooting the enemies before they could get to you, you had to consider spacing on the battlefield between not only yourself and the enemy you were targeting, but also the other enemies in the combat encounter. Alan Wake 2 drops enemy counts significantly, and moves the flashlight boost to a simple button press command. This makes sense for the game as it is. The new source of tension is resource management rather than managing spacing in a given combat encounter, but it certainly does feel less unique in this respect than the original game. That's not to say that Alan Wake 2 pivoting to the survival horror format is a total loss, though. In fact, it's often more effective for being structured this way. The flashlight is still a necessary resource to manage, and now actually doubles as a defensive item, like you might find in a Resident Evil title. Flares actually work similarly, and occasionally you'll get these amazing tableaus where a Taken will be grappling you and you'll blast the darkness off of them to break out. The team also really nailed making the flashlight feel powerful. The visual and sound design surrounding it are perfect. The way it works is right for how the game is constructed now. I just can't help but feel like something has been ever so slightly lost in this mechanical transition. Alongside changes to the flashlight, it's very rare that you'll feel truly overwhelmed in Alan Wake 2, in the same way that some encounters in the original game managed. The average threat level of any one given Taken is much, much higher, and they're all far more resilient, but also far fewer in number. This works really well in some areas and less well in others. Anytime you're exploring a space indoors, peeking around every corner like in the nursing home chapter, the lower count of stronger enemies works just like it does in Resident Evil, fantastically. It's when you're outside that things sometimes don't stack up to where they could in the original game. Some areas in Saga's campaign can feel too sparsely populated. Cauldron Lake during Return 3 definitely comes to mind. Not every area suffers this way, so maybe this was the team trying to create a difficulty curve, but with something like survival horror, I think things could have been a little more intense throughout. This of course only really applies to Saga's campaign. For those who are unaware, Alan Wake 2 features two campaigns, Initiation and Return, Alan being the protagonist of the former, and Saga the latter. Initiation takes place in the Dark Place, Alan's newest escape attempt, and the middle installment of a trilogy of novels formed alongside Departure and Return. We'll dissect that a little bit more later, but for now what I want to look at are the gameplay differences between Initiation and Return. Return is a much more straightforward campaign than Initiation. It very much leans into standard survival horror gameplay, and the settings and characters seen in Alan Wake 1, alongside a few new ones. Initiation, while still part of the same narrative broadly, is a lot different. Return's mechanics are relatively straightforward survival horror mechanics. You move through a normal, relatively sensical world and fight enemies that menace Saga throughout. Conversely, Initiation operates on the dream logic of the Dark Place, and as such has a slightly more out-of-the-box mechanical identity. There are three mechanics that are unique to Initiation that I'd like to explore. The first is how enemies function. Enemies in Initiation are represented as silhouettes until the darkness is burned off of them. Remedy here are being a little tricksy with their design, as not every silhouette is actually an enemy. Especially early on, the vast majority of them aren't really anything at all. The trick here is designed to heighten the survival horror tension by potentially tricking the player into wasting resources unnecessarily. If you get within melee range of a shade while pointing your flashlight at it, it will disappear harmlessly. This creates an interesting source of tension though. There's no way you have enough flashlight charges to eliminate every single shade without getting close, but if you do close in on a real enemy like this, you'll have to react very quickly in order to avoid damage. There are tells you can watch for that will let you know if an enemy is real or not, but the shades can do quite the convincing impression of real enemies at times. It's a really interesting take on survival horror combat that I haven't seen before. It makes it feel as though there's a constant threat to Alan as he walks through the Dark Place, because any of the dozens of shades you pass by regularly could be a dangerous enemy waiting to reveal itself. It's intensified as you move through the chapters of Initiation as well. The deeper into the campaign you get, the more shades there are. It gets to the point where there are huge numbers of them just walking through the streets. The proportion of them that are real enemies remains roughly the same, but the increased number of shades increases both the perceived and real threat. I guarantee you that at some time in your run of Initiation, you'll be tempted to burn unnecessary resources on a group of shades. I know I did, and this was my second playthrough. The other two mechanics of Initiation are more interrelated and actually remind me of Dishonored 2 of all things, which I didn't expect. Both the light moving mechanic and the plot element mechanic seem to me to be inspired by, or at least operate on similar technology, as the Dishonored 2 mission A Crack in the Slab. Throughout the game, Alan can reshape the Dark Place either by illuminating it or through his own creativity. The entire campaign is part of a story, and therefore a product of his imagination. If you change the story, you change the dark place itself, hence the plot beat system. In his major dungeons, Alan can come across scenes from the story he wrote that will change depending on which plot element is currently associated with them. I love this mechanic's ability to not only reflect Alan's character, but also illustrate the powers of the dark place in action. We've seen it illustrated before, sure, but we've never actually been able to participate directly in Alan's reshaping of reality. Each dungeon is its own mini-story that you move through as an observer, following it to its logical conclusion and therefore the murder site. Beyond just the logical application of story beats though, any plot beat can be applied to any scene, which in and of itself creates interesting opportunities to see other aspects of the story taking shape, or even find additional resources. You never know exactly what's going to come through when you apply a given plot beat to each scene, and I always found myself wanting to test each one to see how it shaped the game world, even if I knew it wasn't necessarily going to lead to the game's conclusion. The dual protagonist approach is actually probably the most direct allusion that Alan Wake 2 makes to the Resident Evil series. Almost all of those games feature two protagonists in some fashion, but none in so interesting a way as Alan Wake 2. While Alan and Saga star in separate interconnected stories, the order those stories are experienced in is almost entirely up to player discretion. There is a telegraphed intended order of play, but by no means are you bound to experience the story in that way. This is what I meant earlier when I said that Alan Wake 2 presents itself in such a way that only a video game really could. I suppose you could attempt a non-linear format like this in passive media, but it certainly doesn't lend itself to it. And even if you did, it would lack the bespoke nature that Alan Wake 2 can have because of player input. It's not just done for no reason either. There's a legitimate narrative reason why these campaigns can be played at your discretion. Alan Wake 2 plays around with time a lot, more than any other RCU title at the very least. The Dark Place is well established to run on dream logic, and because of that, there isn't really a linear flow of time there. This is something that came across in other media depicting the Dark Place, but now with this non-linear approach to storytelling, we can experience it firsthand. Even flipping at the telegraphed change points between each overlap chapter, time in Alan Wake 2 doesn't quite match up. Alan comes out of Cauldron Lake after the first overlap boss, Agent Nightingale from the first game. Even after this happens in reality though, Saga is able to talk to Alan in the Dark Place in the past, but further than that, the conversations don't even match up. Even though the speech is garbled, you can tell that the conversations don't actually match up with one another if you pay attention. Alan's murder sites are also out of order with Saga's overlap dungeons. Saga first fights Nightingale, then the deputies, then Cynthia Weaver. Alan's murder sites swap Cynthia and the deputies' positions on the timeline. This mutable timeline leads to one of my biggest pet theories about Alan Wake's world based on the second game. When you finally meet Thomas Zane, diver's suit free, for the first time in Alan Wake 2, he looks just like Alan. This is a cute way for Ilka Villi, the actor who's provided Alan's face since the very beginning, to play a full role, but it's also a long-term payoff. Since Alan Wake 1, characters have referred to Alan directly as Tom, and now we officially know why. It's not just that Alan and Zane have some similar elements to their stories, the two of them, literally, canonically, look perfectly alike. My thoughts on the situation are as follows. Much like it's eventually revealed that Alan and Scratch are the same person at different points in time, I believe the same to be true about Alan and Zane. I should clarify a bit here. I don't so much think that Zane is an alter ego of Alan, but actually vice versa. Zane came first, and over his decades in the Dark Place, Alan was born to be part of the story that takes place in Alan Wake 1. It's established that once you've been in the Dark Place, it lingers with you, even if you somehow manage to get out. I believe this to be because of the non-linear nature of the Dark Place. Even if you leave, you're somehow always there, occupying a sort of paranatural superposition wherein you both are and aren't in the Dark Place, simultaneously. This is the position that Alan explicitly occupies for the entire story, and I would argue the same is true for Alice as well, based on how much of a direct impact she has on the narrative. She makes direct contact with both Alan and Saga, and even provides them with key items that help to bring about the ending. Extrapolating that out further though, we could see Thomas Zane as having been in this superposition for decades during which he was constantly going through cycles of writing and forgetting that we see Alan going through in the main campaign. I don't think it's a very big stretch to say that during one of those many cycles, he wrote a story, and that story was the narrative of Alan Wake. Not Departure, but the meta-novel that we see an excerpt from in the well-lit room in the first game. This theory would also fit in with what we learn in the campaign about the Anderson family. They're Nordic seers who can literally see through the paranatural phenomena caused by the Dark Place. Tor and Odin always, without fail, refer to Alan as Tom, both in the first game and the second game. Everyone else in the story is fooled by the magic fiction, except of course Ahti the janitor, who also refers to Alan as Tom. If all of that wasn't proof enough for you though, take a look at the credits of Thomas Zane's short film, Jötun that gets screened directly after Alan clears the final murder site. One of the credits during the opening title sequence literally says, Thomas Zane is the writer Alan Wake. Remedy loves being weird and cryptic with their work, and always shows a strong attention to detail. I don't think they would have worded this credit this way if they didn't mean it to explicitly confirm that Thomas Zane and Alan Wake are one and the same. I mentioned the fact that the Anderson brothers are Nordic seers in that previous paragraph, and that's another aspect of Alan Wake that's particularly charming to me. The game leans a lot more heavily into the fact that Remedy are a Finnish studio. Right next to Bright Falls is the town of Watery, itself a deep-cut reference to some more ancillary pieces of RCU lore that came out in the wake of Alan Wake 1. Watery, in the lore, is a town founded by Finnish immigrants, and as such, many of the major characters in Alan Wake 2 are Finnish in origin, and there are various Finnish cultural elements that are used in the game's story. It's small, but it adds a great sense of personality and uniqueness to the game that you rarely see in big-budget releases. Control had shades of this with Ahti and his ramblings, laden with Finnish colloquialisms, but that personal touch has been expanded massively in Alan Wake 2. I read an article that actually stated that Matthew Peretta was chosen to voice Alan in the first game because Ilkka Ville, while perfectly fluent in English, would still have had an accent that the studio thought wouldn't sell. Maybe that's true, but Alan Wake 2 is much better of a work for having embraced Remedy's Finnishness, and allowing some of that culture to seep into the game. You almost never see this kind of cultural fingerprint on AAA titles. Usually with a project that has as much of an operating budget as Alan Wake 2, $75 million in this case, the suits are involved to a degree that doesn't allow for this level of cultural incorporation. This kind of thing would normally be relegated to the indie market. That isn't meant to be a disparagement. It's simply to say that AAA releases usually have their creativity stifled by corporate influence. Remedy, despite their much higher budget, are still technically an independent studio. That's what allows them to get away with being so weird about their releases and adding these kinds of personal, cultural touches. Besides just the overall Finnishness of the game, though, Alan Wake 2 continues with something we've discussed since the original chapter: the studio's penchant for mixing live-action elements into their games. I mentioned in the chapter on Control that they had finally struck a decent balance between the live-action content and the gameplay, but I actually think that Alan Wake 2 is the one that does it the best thus far. In Control, a lot of the live-action content wasn't mandatory. You'd see the silhouettes for the hotline calls overlaid in the world, or shots of Dr. Darling's PSAs, but if you wanted to get the full clips, you'd actually have to go into the menu and play them manually. Alan Wake 2 uses live-action as part of its cutscenes regularly, but never in the real world. This is an extrapolation of the artistic use of live action that I discussed in my Control chapter. Live action in the RCU games is used to convey the uncanny and the paranatural. Thus, the live action segments are only seen within the Dark Place, or some kind of overlap. Applying the live action to a horror context specifically, though, is very interesting. Remedy are directly weaponizing the Uncanny Valley in order to create discomfort in the player on multiple levels. The Northlight engine in Alan Wake 2 is capable of creating a stunning level of visual fidelity in its facial animations, so the in-game character models look almost exactly like their live-action counterparts. Almost. There's just enough of a disconnect there that it still feels weird, disjointed, and otherworldly to see Ilkka Ville and Sam Lake pop up in high-definition live-action alongside their animated counterparts. This isn't a mistake, though. It's 100% deliberate. That discomfort created by the Uncanny Valley adds to the horror and the otherworldly atmosphere rather than detracting from it, just like in Control. This means that the events taking place in the Dark Place feel counterintuitively more surreal than if they were presented in-engine. It's a fantastic way for Remedy to incorporate their mixed media approach. They even use the Dark Place to combine further mediums beyond just those of video games and live action, with the introduction of musical theater. That's right, baby, we're back to the Remedy musical level ranking list, with the first of Alan Wake 2's 2 musical levels. Each campaign gets its own, and right now we're talking about Alan's. That's Initiation Chapter 3, We Sing, with the spectacular and much memified Herald of Darkness. In one of their ballsiest moves yet, Remedy chose to present Alan's backstory as a rock opera performed in the Dark Place by the old gods, Mr. Door and Alan himself. This level is not only an incredible and imaginative way to reintroduce Alan's backstory to players who might not have been hanging around for 13 years waiting for Alan Wake 2, but it does so in such a way that existing fans will still find it interesting and entertaining. It also doubles as excellent foreshadowing of the eventual reveal that Alan and Scratch are the same person, the main hook literally reading, "Show me the champion of light, I'll show you the herald of darkness." I could lie and say that I realized this foreshadowing on my second playthrough, but I actually realized it while listening to the song on loop because it's just an absolute 13-minute banger. We Sing also manages to balance horrific and comedic tonalities perfectly. The whole number is inherently kind of funny. Musical theater requires a level of suspension of disbelief that comes with a complete commitment to the art form. Shoving a random musical theater style number into your survival horror game, with characters explaining their emotions and stories through song, is going to feel weird and inherently a little comedic. This tonality, though, with Mr. Door's smug face and Alan's comedic overwrought acting, juxtaposes really well with the player character Alan's genuine struggle against the enemies and his overall aggrieved existence in the Dark Place. This makes the comedic aspect read as a mockery of Alan. It feels like the Dark Place is laughing at him by presenting his struggles as a stage play, with mocking stage directions drawn in spike tape like "Act scared!" This makes what would otherwise be a purely comedic sequence still feel in step with the rest of the dark story. To top it all off, the level is paced perfectly, leaning into another musical theater convention. Herald of Darkness uses instrumental vamps to make it so that players will always be hearing the correct parts of the song at the intended time. Everyone's going to see the giant picture of Alan standing with the flashlight when Odin sings
Still he's a torchbearer, and it couldn't be much clearer.
no matter how long they may take to resolve the prior combat encounter. If you listen to the track on the album, the vamps are part of the song too, they're guitar solos. But the in-game sequence allows for extra noodling to turn those solos into vamps that allow the level to keep its proper pacing. The level is pretty much perfect, and I love every second of it, which is why it earns the spot of number 2? Yes, contrary to popular opinion, and in spite of all the praise I've heaped on it, I do prefer Alan Wake 2's other musical level to We Sing. Don't get me wrong, it's obvious I love We Sing with all my heart, but Saga's musical level does edge it out for me. Why is that? Well, I'll get into it in a moment, but in order to do so, we have to discuss my favorite thing about Alan Wake 2, its meta elements. I've discussed how all of the RCU games have some pretty heavy meta elements, but Alan Wake 2 is the game where that finally gets kicked into overdrive. In a lot of ways, Alan Wake 2 is the first game that actually codifies the RCU, a full game with direct crossovers between the FBC and Alan Wake, with remnants of their activities littering Bright Falls in the form of nursery rhyme experiments, the Cauldron Lake monitoring station, and direct collaboration between Saga and the FBC. It's more than just that, though. A couple of times, I've alluded to the fact that there are other Remedy titles that aren't part of the RCU officially, Max Payne and Quantum Break, to be specific. In what can only be described as Sam Lake and Remedy's biggest fuck you to the corporate entities that own those IPs, the characters from those games appear in Alan Wake 2, but as essentially video brincado mockbusters of themselves. They're the same in almost every way, but just barely legally distinct enough to avoid being sued. I talked in the chapter on Alan Wake 1 about the fact that Alex Casey is clearly supposed to be an allusion to Max Payne. That allusion is made explicit in Alan Wake 2, where we meet the real-life Alex Casey, and he is literally, in every way, Max Payne. Sam Lake provides his face, just like Max Payne. The late great James McCaffrey provides his voice, and when he does, it's exactly the same as, you guessed it, Max Payne's. The same is true for Tim Breaker, who's Jack Joyce from Quantum Break, and Warland Dorr, whose name is almost exactly Martin Hatch. Seriously, just flip the W upside down, add a cross to the L, and you're there. It's some Wick Donalds tier shit. Dorr is played by a different actor, as unfortunately Lance Reddick passed away between Quantum Break and Alan Wake 2, depriving us of both Hatch and Charon in the John Wick movies. But the character is clearly supposed to be another legally distinct ripoff of Remedy's own prior work. What does this mean, exactly? Well, apart from being a way for Remedy to softly reclaim their intellectual property, I'm not totally sure myself, but there are some clues. Alan can stumble upon Tim Breaker in the Dark Place at various points in each dungeon, and he'll provide you with some helpful clues as to where you can find resources and words of power. But he also alludes to the fact that he sees other versions of himself in his dreams. Much like Alan was able to scry on the life of the real-life Alex Casey in order to write his novels, it seems like Tim is able to do the same thing with other versions of himself. It's pretty clear that at least one of those other versions is Jack Joyce in all but name. Dorr seems to be able to travel between universes, like his namesake, Hatch, although it's unclear if he seems to have alternate versions. All of this seems to suggest a sort of Remedy-connected multiverse, wherein the games that aren't directly part of the RCU are canon, although whether that's just an Easter egg or a promise waiting to be brought to fruition remains a mystery at this point. Where shit gets really wild, though, is when Alan Wake starts to cross over with the real world. Not in throwaway references like the radio show in the original game, but actual cutscenes that are part of the immediate narrative. In one of the live-action Mr. Door cutscenes, Sam Lake appears as himself, the actor who portrays Alex Casey. It's still a layer away from being exact reality, but it's close enough that it's simultaneously hilarious and head-scratching. I'm not entirely sure what the scene means, although my best guess is that it's sort of an Easter egg for Max Payne fans. Lake appears again as himself at the end of the cinema dungeon, where you reenact a literal, ham-fisted death of the author. Alan's writing is getting more desperate and sloppy the closer he gets to the exit. Way too obvious metaphors and half-crafted dialogue. It's a funny scene, but I think it ties into Alan Wake 2's major theme. In a lot of ways, Alan Wake 2 is about its own myth as a piece of media. Its own deeply troubled process of creation. I think this theme comes across particularly well in Alan's campaign, but it's present in both. Alan Wake 2 presents the creative process as a literal hero's journey. That's why the trilogy of novels Alan writes in the two games are called Departure, Initiation, and Return. Departure being the inception of the idea, Alan Wake 1, Initiation representing the development hell that Alan Wake 2 went through for 13 years, and then Return being the realization and reception of that new project. This comes across to me with the constant drafting present in Initiation, Alan's frustration and endless attempts to escape the Dark Place. Think about it. The game was in development hell for 13 years. Over that time, the team must have gone through dozens of possible scripts and plots, trying to get it right, while struggling against financial roadblocks in their way. At times, it must have felt like constantly spinning your wheels in the dirt, just like Alan constantly looping back, unable to escape the Dark Place. Each of his different attempts in Initiation showed different approaches. There's the straightforward approach in the basic, normal Alex Casey story that he sets in the subway tunnels. When that doesn't work, he and Zane have a drug-fueled bender with the hilarious, "It's called Return, because we return," epiphany. This is the desperate response when the straightforward approach doesn't work. The story produced in the second draft of Initiation is far more complicated than in the first draft, with the meta play and the hidden identities. That still doesn't work though, and so he loops back again, and we see that frustration and rage in the scene where he shoots Zane. Interesting to note, if Alan and Zane are the same person as I suspect, this is an act of suicide. I think it's also important to note that with the reveal of Scratch as an alter ego of Alan himself, the enemy of Alan Wake 1 that represented editorial forces has become internal. Alan has the dark presence within himself, and that's stymieing his ability to create with intrusive edits. He's unable to get anything done because he can't even agree with himself on what he wants the story to be. In order for the magic of the Dark Place to work, the creator of the art being made into reality must sincerely believe in the creation, and Alan is so unsure that none of his works are able to become reality. It's only after Alan willingly unites himself with the Dark Presence in his despair at the end of the story that he finally writes a work that can come true. That work is dark and destructive because it comes from a place of despair and the evil of the Dark Place, but he does finally sincerely believe in it, and therefore it changes reality. That work we're experiencing is Return by Scratch, a compound story made up of numerous drafts that only came to light through the collaboration of numerous Allans. Sound anything like the process of game development hell to you? It definitely does to me. Saga's campaign in Return is more straightforward then. It's the expansion on the story of Alan Wake 1 that we all wanted. Alan comes back from the Dark Place, new characters battle the power of the Dark Presence, we see the main street of Bright Falls again in all of its newfound high-definition glory. A lot of Return is deliberate fan service, and that becomes part of the explicit narrative in the final chapters. When Scratch finally gets a hold of the clicker and manages to make the story reality, the world turns into an eternal Deerfest, with everyone jerking off his work 24/7 because of the fan service that it provided to fans of Alan Wake 1. The writers were making fun of me directly with the Deerfest sequence in Return Chapter 9, and you know what? They were right on the money. I absolutely lost my shit when I was walking through Deerfest as Alan and heard one of the masked attendees saying, "The glorious stage fight from Departure is clearly one-upped by the absolutely incredible Dark Ocean summoning." Yes, I am a Remedy and Alan Wake sycophant. Now serve me my slop and give me my fan service, please. It's that long wait and this narrative concern that Alan Wake 2 has with its own creation that makes Dark Ocean Summoning my favorite Remedy musical level of all of them. Dark Ocean Summoning is all but explicitly a love letter to the people who stayed with Alan Wake as an IP from the very beginning. The people like me, who were waiting 13 years with bated breath to see the moment that Alan finally breaks free of the Dark Place. For real this time. It's the climax of not only the game's themes about its own creation, but the real-world 13-year wait that we had to sit through to hear what came after the ellipsis. Is it total unrepentant fan service? Yes. Did I also wholeheartedly and unironically love every second of it? More than you could possibly imagine. The lyrics are evocative, not just of the narrative, but my own real-world emotions towards the creative work that is Alan Wake 2. That's the real power of Remedy's meta-storytelling. They can reach out and grab at the actual real-world emotions that you, the player, have experienced toward their games, and tug viscerally and explicitly on those heartstrings. The player who's waited 13 years for Alan to come out of the Dark Place is now getting to actively save one of their favorite characters, rather than just passively witness his escape. Dark Ocean Summoning is the climax of Remedy's creative priorities as of Alan Wake 2. It's also just absolutely badass. The track featuring a riff inspired by Zeppelin's Immigrant Song that serves as a perfect accompaniment to the sequence. Dark Ocean Summoning is both the narrative and mechanical climax of the game. Waves and waves of Taken emerging from the lake, trying to overpower Saga, and the player fighting back against them in a violent frenzy with everything they have. Alan Wake 2's combat feels a lot more visceral and immediate than prior RCU titles, and so frantically moving around the arena shooting Taken here becomes a real moment of fight or flight, wherein the only option left is the former. This makes it so that, like was the case with We Sing and Herald of Darkness, Dark Ocean Summoning always feels like it's properly paced along with the music. The track itself runs at exactly the right tempo to feel good alongside the rhythm of Saga's most powerful guns, and so it doesn't need to pull any tricks to make that viscerally satisfying game feel, it just has it naturally. All of these things are what make Return Chapter 7 the #1 RCU musical level to date. It just hasn't been beat, and I don't know if it will. Alan Wake 2 actually features 2 endings depending on whether you've played the game in its original mode or New Game Plus. And to be honest with you, I actually prefer the one where you get the least context. Throughout the game, Alan's story has been slowly killing Saga's daughter, Logan. Not instantly, but over time as it becomes reality. The original ending featured Saga and Alan confronting Scratch with a bullet of light, finalizing a new ending, and then Saga calling to see if her daughter would answer. It holds just long enough, but cuts off right before we see whether she answers. In the New Game Plus ending, we get a little more voiceover from Alan and actually see the plan come to fruition, which I think is kind of tonally inappropriate for the story. Alan Wake 2 is horror media, and the ambiguous ending of the main campaign actually feels like a conclusion to a horror story. Look at the end of my favorite movie, John Carpenter's The Thing. After a whole movie of R.J. McCready trying to kill this disgusting, shape-shifting beast, we think he's finally done it. Then Childs comes out of the wreckage, and we fade out on a tense shot of the two of them just waiting to freeze to death. The fear and mistrust instilled by the Thing, leaving them both unable to leave, whether they're infected or not. The original ending of Alan Wake 2 has this kind of ambiguity. Before the final draft actually came out, I thought that Alan was going to be freed from the dark place in either the DLC or Control. The "it's not a loop, it's a spiral" line suggested to me that Alan Wake 2 was progress towards his eventual escape, but not his final deliverance. I had assumed that this was the initiation chapter of Alan's hero's journey from a meta perspective, hence all the emphasis on the monomyth in the game's storytelling. The final draft ending confirming that everything worked and showing Alan is finally free is perhaps more narratively satisfying, but it's less dramatically satisfying. It undercuts the tone of the game thus far. The thing is, despite my reservations about the final draft's ending from a tonal perspective, I do understand why Remedy put it in. I don't have any hard evidence to back this up, so take everything I say here with a heaping helping of salt, but I suspect that Remedy added the more narratively satisfying ending because they weren't sure whether they were going to recoup their investment. The final draft wasn't announced till December, and Alan Wake 2 released in October. There was a lot of rumbling about the game underperforming commercially shortly after its release, and I think Remedy were worried that they might have to abandon this story and these characters like they've had to so many times before. My suspicion is that they added the final draft ending so that players wouldn't be left waiting another 13 years for a proper conclusion to Alan's imprisonment, in the event that the game had underperformed hard enough that they couldn't pursue further Alan Wake games. Luckily enough, it was just recently announced that the studio did recoup their investment, and are planning to make more Alan Wake and Control titles. This leaves the final draft and Alan Wake in general in sort of a weird spot, though. By the end of the final draft, things are wrapped up pretty nicely. Alan's free, thanks to some help from Alice, Saga's daughter is safe, Alex Casey is safe, and the Dark Presence is seemingly defeated. Where does this IP go from here? I'm not sure, but I have some faith in Remedy's ability to figure it out. We've still got the Alan Wake 2 DLCs on the horizon, as well as Control 2, so we'll see where things go from here. Even with the official canon ending being the one I find to be less tonally appropriate, I still love the absolute shit out of Alan Wake 2. It gave me everything I had waited for and more, and it's just a hell of a lot of fun. I like Control well enough, but I feel that the game had a ways to go before it fully realized its creative vision. Alan Wake 2 is excellent from the bottom to the top. The gameplay is resonant and satisfying, its tone and narrative are intriguing and harmonious. The game is just an absolute tour de force, and I'm glad I waited 13 years for it. I just hope the wait is a little bit shorter next time. Please? It's been a pleasure for me to sink my teeth into these games and dissect them a little bit for the channel. You may have noticed that this video is a little bit lighter on the analytical side of things and a little heavier on the descriptive aspect, and that's largely because anytime I start to talk about the RCU titles, I just wind up wanting to talk theories and lore half the time. I do think these titles have interesting things to say about creativity and how it can be stifled by the corporate entertainment industry, and I hope that I've discussed that adequately. But I also just love their world and how odd they are. A lot of the fun of the Remedy-connected universe comes from its deliberate strangeness and meta elements. It's also just a breath of fresh air from the conventional styles of stories we see with AAA budgets. These stories and worlds have connected with me for years, and this video was largely an excuse for me to share what I love, and sometimes hate about them, with any of you who will listen. I don't really think the RCU games are high art or anything. They're not going to change the way you view the human condition like Disco Elysium might. but they are extremely novel and different aesthetic experiences in the world of video games. Alan Wake opened my mind to the possibilities of what kinds of stories video games could tell when I was a kid, and Remedy's work is still pursuing and expanding on that goal even 13 years later. The games are all crafted with passion and love, and it's just so obvious in the playing of them. They feel like the product of passionate artists working in collaboration with one another on a project they all believe in, rather than just a product like so many AAA titles nowadays can be. That love and heart that went into making them is infectious. It seeped into my tween-aged mind and left a mark there forever that I think will be obvious to anyone who's listened this far. And that, in and of itself, is an artistic achievement. I love the crazy, meta, and bizarre world of the RCU, even at its least engaging, and I absolutely can't wait to see where Sam Lake and his cohorts take things next. I'll be waiting with bated breath to see what the Master of Many Worlds gets up to in his next major outing. Whatever it is, I'm sure it'll be just as strange, just as novel, and just as unique. Thanks for listening, and come back again soon.
There's an old town wrought with mystery of Tom the poet and his muse, and a magic lake which gave a life to the words the poet used. Now the muse she was his happiness, and he rhymed about her grace, and told her stories of treasures deep beneath the blackened waves. Till in the stillness of one dawn, still in its misty crown, the muse she went down to the lake, and in the waves she drowned. And now to see your love set free, you'll need the witch's cabin key. Find the lady of the light, gone mad with the night. That's how you reshape destiny. The poet came down to the lake to call out to his dear. When there was no answer, he was overcome with fear. He searched in vain for his treasure lost, and too soon the night would fall, and only his own echo would wail back at his call. And when he swore to bring back his love by stories he'd create, nightmares shifted in their sleep in the darkness of the lake. And now to see your love set free, you'll need the witch's cabin key. Find the lady of the light, still raving in the night. That's how you reshape destiny. In the dead of night she came to him with darkness in her eyes, wearing a morning gown, sweet words as her disguise. He took her in without a word, for he saw his grave mistake, and vowed them both to silence deep beneath the lake. Now if it's real or just a dream, one mystery remains, for it is said on moonless nights they may still haunt this place.